Thank you, Eileen. I want to tell you a little bit more about Robert Davis, Bob Davis to most of us. He is the author of A Soldier Story, The Ghost of Andrew Lewis, is a noted Civil War historic interpreter and reenactor. He is a member of the 29th U.S. Colored Troops Regiment, which originated in Illinois before they were federalized. He serves on the board of directors for the Abraham Lincoln Association and for Looking for Lincoln Heritage Coalition. And he also, long before all of that, he received his BA from Wayne State University, Detroit, and his Master of Public Affairs from Princeton University. And I guess one master's wasn't enough for him, so he got an MBA from the University of Chicago shortly after that. He and his wife, Patricia, live in Springfield, Illinois, and Patricia joins him on the stage. Mr. Davis.
Good evening. At the outbreak of the Civil War, two of the fundamental questions were, is this merely a white man's war to save the Union? And the second question, will the black man fight for union and freedom? In the first weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, Northern Negroes joined in the outbursts of patriotism and offered their services to the government to help suppress the rebellion. They were prepared to fight for their freedom. Despite the fact that Negro soldiers had fought in the Revolution of 1776 and the War of 1812, a federal law barred black men from serving in state militias, and there were none in the regular United States Army. Several northern states and the federal government openly refused the offers of assistance from black men. Nevertheless, black leaders continued to urge the necessity of enrolling black troops. They knew that if the black man proved his patriotism and courage on the field of battle, the nation would be morally obligated to grant him first-class citizenship. It was Frederick Douglass, that famous abolitionist, who, in a speech in Philadelphia in 1861, said, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, a musket on his shoulders, and bullets in his pockets, and there is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States."
James McPherson, in Marching Toward Freedom, points out that there were two main objections to the enlistment of colored troops. First was the deep-seated racial prejudice of many Northerners. Second, many people in the North believed black men, especially ex-slaves, were too servile and cowardly to make good soldiers. Lincoln summed up both types of opposition to Negro enlistment in two public statements. On August 4th, 1862, an Indiana delegation offered the government 2 regiments of black men, but the president declined the offer, saying,
"To arm Negroes would turn 50,000 bayonets from the loyal border states against us that were for us."
And 6 weeks later, Lincoln told another delegation that,
"If we were to arm the Negroes, I fear that in a few weeks, the arms would be in the hands of the rebels."
Despite the government's official opposition to Negro soldiers, some Union generals tried to enlist black men in 1862. Out in Kansas, General James Lane raised 2 regiments of black men composed of fugitive slaves from Missouri and free Negroes from the North. Lane's black troopers were not officially recognized by the War Department until early 1863. But in the meantime, they had participated in several successful fights against rebel bushwhackers in Kansas and Missouri.
While this was occurring, Northern public opinion was shifting to the idea of arming the Negroes as attitudes began to change due to military losses. Alan Gelso, in his book, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, points out that Lincoln had every reason to be worried about the course of the war. In the East, McClellan's Grand Army had bogged down on the peninsula, was repelled from the gates of Richmond, and retreated to a fortified camp on the James River. Stonewall Jackson had scoured the Shenandoah, and Lee and Jackson together had administered a punishing defeat to John Pope in August 1862 at Second Bull Run. Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists argued that the Union Army, by not using black men as soldiers, gave away a mighty element of strength. They stated that slavery was a source of strength for the Confederacy. Slaves worked in the fields and factories. They dug trenches and drove wagons for the Confederate Army. Without their labor, the South would collapse and the North would win the war. They further argued that a proclamation of emancipation would cripple the South by encouraging slaves to flee their masters and come over to the North, where freedom was awaiting them.
On July 17, 1862, Congress passed 2 acts providing for the enlistment of Negroes as soldiers. The first was the Confiscation Act, which empowered the president to employ as many persons of African descent as he may deem necessary and proper to suppress the rebellion. The second was a Militia Act, which repealed the provisions of the 1792 law barring black men and authorizing the employment of them as soldiers. In spite of these 2 acts, the spirit of these 2 acts were combined in President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation issued January 1, 1863, wherein he invited the black man to join the Union Army and fight for his freedom.
The first regiment organized from freed slaves was the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Regiment on the Sea Islands, which was soon followed by the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Regiment. Colonel Higginson and Montgomery, commanders of the 1st and 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Regiments, respectively, led their men on several successful raids in the interior of Georgia and Florida. And in March 1863, they captured and occupied Jacksonville. Colonel Higginson, in his action report, stated that no officer in the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Regiment now doubts that the key to the successful prosecution of this war lies in the unlimited employment of black troops.
On April 30th, their commander, General David Hunter, commander of the Department of the South, reported to Secretary Stanton, "I am happy to be able to announce to you my complete and eminent satisfaction with the results of the organization of colored regiments in this department. In the field, these regiments have proved brave, active, and energetic, so conducting themselves that even our enemies have not yet been able to allege against them a single violation of any of the rules of civilized warfare. I am also happy to announce to you that the prejudice of certain of our white soldiers against these indispensable allies are rapidly softening or fading out."
Lincoln, on April the 1st, responded to General Hunter saying, "I am glad to see the accounts of your colored force at Jacksonville, Florida. It is important to the enemy that such a force shall not take shape and grow and thrive in the South, and in precisely the same proportion, it is important to us that it shall."
These enthusiastic official dispatches were written for the eyes of the Northern public, as well as the Secretary of War, and most of the reports found their way into the newspapers.
On March 28, 1863, the New York Tribune stated editorially, Facts are beginning to dispel prejudices. Enemies of the Negro race who have persistently denied their capacity and doubted their courage are refuted by the good conduct and gallant deeds of these men whom they persecute and slander.
2 days earlier, Lincoln had written to Andrew Johnson, war governor of Tennessee.
I am told you have at least thought of raising a Negro military force. In my opinion, the country now needs no specific thing so much as some man of your ability and position to go do this work. The colored population is a great available and yet unavailed up force for restoring the Union. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers upon the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. And who doubts that we can present that sight if we but take hold in earnest?
It had become clear that the president had experienced a complete change of mind since the previous September, when he had feared that arms placed in the hands of Negroes would soon find their way into the hands of rebels. The change could also be seen in the action within the War Department. On May 22nd, the Bureau of Colored Troops was established under General Order Number 143 to coordinate and administer all matters related to the raising of colored regiments in every part of the country. All African American regiments were now to be designated United States Colored Troops. By the first week of August 1863, there were 14 colored regiments in the field or ready for service, and 24 additional regiments were in the process of organization. 5 of the 14 battle-ready regiments had been recruited in the North. But when Northern Negroes, seeing much less to flock to the colors now than the outbreak of the war, first, the economy had created full employment and prosperity for Northern Negroes. And second, captured Negro soldiers would not be treated as ordinary prisoners of war. And third, all commissioned officers in Negro regiments must be white.
Nevertheless, recruiting agents blanketed Northern Negro communities with posters, editorials, and speeches. The Anglo-African newspaper stated, "Should we not, with 2 centuries of cruel wrong stirring in our hearts, be but too willing to embrace any chance to settle accounts with the slaveholders? Why should we be alarmed at their threat of hanging us? Do we intend to become their prisoners? Such is not the record our black fathers made in the Revolutionary War, nor is such the record of those who fought under McDowell and also Jackson in the War of 1812. At a meeting of black men in Asbury Church, Silas Bowen of Washington said, "When we show that we are men, we can then demand our liberty, as did the Revolutionary Fathers, peacefully if we can, forcefully if we must. If we do not fight, we are traitors to our God, traitors to our country, traitors to our race, and traitors to ourselves. Richmond is the place for us, and we mean to go there. Our friend Jeff Davis says we shall go there, and we will go, but they won't be glad to see us." The regiment gained 140 recruits at this meeting.
In the summer of 1863, the War Department authorized governors of several northern states to recruit Negro regiments to help fulfill their state troop quota. The previous year, John Mercer Langston, an Ohio black leader, had urged Governor David Todd to enlist black volunteers to be credited against Ohio's quota. Governor Todd had rejected the suggestion with these words: "Do you not know, Mr. Langston, that this is a white man's government? that white men are able to defend and protect it, when we want you colored men, we will notify you. By June 1863, Governor Todd had decided that he wanted black men. He notified Langston and gave him authority to enlist colored soldiers. Langston and his assistants began to canvass the state. By November, the Ohio Regiment was ready for service. Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Illinois all began to organize black regiments in the summer of 1863.
The New York Tribune observed on May 1st, 1863, that most Northerners now approved of the policy of arming Negroes, but that many still doubted whether they would make good soldiers. The colored soldiers would answer this question themselves. On May 27, 1863, 2 regiments of New Orleans free men and Louisiana ex-slaves participated in an assault on Port Hudson, a Confederate stronghold on the lower Mississippi. The attack failed, but the men fought heroically, advancing over open ground in the face of deadly artillery fire that convinced many former skeptics of the value of black troops. William Wells Brown wrote the following account of the Port Hudson assault.
The black forces consisted of the 1st Louisiana and the 3rd Louisiana. The line officers of the 3rd were white, and the regiment was mostly composed of freedmen, many of whose backs still bore the marks of the lash. The 1st was the noted regiment called the Native Guard. At last the word was given and the men started. The enemy opened a blistering fire of shell, canister, grape, and musketry. At every pace the column was thinned by the falling dead and wounded. No matter how gallantly the men behaved, no matter how bravely they were led, it was not in the course of things that this gallant brigade should take these works by charge. 6 charges in all were made. Seeing the taking of these batteries to be a hopeless effort, the troops were called off. But had they accomplished anything more than the loss of many of their brave men? Yes, they had. The self-forgetfulness, the undaunted heroism, and the great endurance of the Negro created a new chapter in history for the American colored man.
General Nathan Banks, in his official report of the battle, stated that whatever doubt may have existed, the history of this day proves conclusively that the government will find in this class of troops effective supporters and defenders. The severe tests to which they were subjected and the determined manner in which they encountered the enemy leaves in my mind no doubt about their ultimate success.
A white officer of engineers who had witnessed the assault declared that you have no idea how many prejudices with regard to Negro troops have been dispelled by the battle the other day. The brigade of Negroes behaved magnificently and fought splendidly, could not have done better. They are far superior in discipline to the white troops and just as brave.
And the New York Times, commenting on the reports of the battle, said that this official testimony settles the question that the Negro race can fight. It is no longer possible to doubt the bravery and steadiness of the colored race.
On June 7th, 2 regiments of newly recruited freedmen beat back a Confederate attack at Milliken's Bend, a Union outpost on the Mississippi River above Vicksburg. The Negroes displayed great courage while driving the rebels back in a furious bayonet charge. Captain M.M. Miller, 3 days after the battle of the 9th Regiment of Louisiana Volunteers of African descent, wrote to his aunt in Galena, Illinois,
Dear Aunt, we were attacked here at Milliken's Bend on June 7th, about 3 o'clock in the morning, by a brigade of Texas troops, about 2,500 in number. We had about 600 men to withstand them, 500 of them Negroes. Our regiment had about 300 in the fight. We had about 50 men killed in the regiment and 80 wounded, so you can judge what part of the fight my company sustained. I never more wish to hear the expression, "The colors won't fight." The enemy charged us so close that we fought with our bayonets hand to hand. It was a horrible fight, the worst I was ever engaged in, not even Shiloh. The enemy cried, "No quarter!" but some of them were very glad to take it when made prisoners. What few men I have left seem to think much of me because I stood up with them in the fight. I can say for them that I never saw a braver company of men in my life.
Even the rebel general commanding the assault on Milliken's Bend gave a somewhat left-handed compliment to the Negro soldiers. General Henry McCullough, Confederate States of America, stated, "This charge was resisted by the Negro portion of the enemy's force with considerable obstinacy, while the white and true Yankee portion ran like whipped curs almost as soon as the charge was given."
Charles Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, visited Milliken's Bend a few days after the battle and later wrote that, "The bravery of the blacks in the battle at Milliken's Bend completely revolutionized the sentiment of the Army with regard to the employment of Negro troops. I heard prominent officers who formerly in private had sneered at the idea of Negroes fighting. They expressed themselves after that heartily in favor of it."
And General Lorenzo Thomas, the War Department's official recruiter of Negro troops in the Mississippi Valley, reported that when he undertook his task, the prejudice against colored troops was quite general, and it required, in the first instance, all my efforts to counteract it. But finally, it was overcome, and the blacks themselves, subsequently, by their coolness and determination in battle, fought themselves into their present high standing as soldiers.
Back in May of 1863, Governor Andrews of Massachusetts had said that his reputation would rise or fall with the success or failure of the 54th Massachusetts.
At twilight.
Rarely in history did a regiment so completely justify the faith of its founders.
At twilight on July 18th, the 54th led an assault on Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold guarding the entrance of Charleston Harbor. The Negro regiment charged across the narrow slit of sand, led by its white colonel, Robert Shaw. As the column approached the fort, the Confederates opened a murderous fire, cutting wide swaths in the ranks of the 54th. Still, the 54th came on, charging the parapets, swarming into the fort itself. Shaw was killed at the head of his regiment, as his men fought on desperately, despite the failure of supporting white regiments to come up in time, which compelled a general retreat. The 54th's assault on Fort Wagner was, in a narrow sense, a failure, but in a broader sense, it was a significant triumph. In the face of heavy odds, black troops had proved once again their courage, determination, and the willingness to die for the freedom of their race. The Northern press publicized widely the exploits of the 54th. The veteran abolitionist Angelina Grimke Weld asked a friend, "Do you not rejoice and exult in all that praise that is lavished upon our brave colored troops, even by pro-slavery papers? I have no tears to shed over their graves, because I see that their heroism is working a great change in public opinion, forcing all men to see the sin and the shame of enslaving such men."
It was not only the newspapers and orators who lavished praise upon Negro soldiers. On August the 23rd, 1863, General Grant himself penned a private letter to President Lincoln.
I have given the subject of arming the Negro my hearty support. This, with the emancipation of the Negro, is the heaviest blow yet given the Confederacy. By arming the Negro, we have added a powerful ally. They will make good soldiers, and taking them from the enemy weakens him in the same proportion they strengthen us. I am therefore most decidedly in favor of pushing this policy to the enlistment of a force sufficient to hold all of the South falling into our hands and to aid in capturing more.
By the end of the year, Secretary of War Edward M. Stanton reported to Lincoln that though many persons questioned whether the freed slaves had sufficient courage and could adjust to military discipline and combat experience, their combat experience proved how groundless were these apprehensions. Stanton later reported, "The slave proved his manhood and his capacity as an infantry soldier at Milliken's Bend, at the assault on Port Hudson, and the storming of Fort Wagner." During the same period, Lincoln in a letter confronted these same attitudes and beliefs which existed right here in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln had received an invitation from longtime friend James C. Conkling of Springfield, Illinois, asking him to address an upcoming mass meeting of unconditional Union men. Many of these men objected to Lincoln's policy emancipating and using Negroes as soldiers. Lincoln's letter was accompanied by a brief note which read,
"I cannot leave here now. Herewith is a letter instead. You are one of the best public readers. I have but one suggestion. Read it very slowly. And now God bless you and all the good Union men."
Lincoln in this letter confronts his critics. What follows is a condensed version of this letter dated August 26, 1863.
"But to be plain, you are dissatisfied with me about the Negro. Quite likely, there is a difference of opinion between you and myself upon that subject. I certainly wish that all men could be free, while I suppose you do not. Yet, I have neither adopted nor proposed any measure which is not consistent with even your view, provided you are for the Union. I suggested compensated emancipation, to which you replied, you wish not to be taxed by Negroes. But I had not asked you to be taxed by Negroes, except in such a way as to save you from greater taxation, to save the Union exclusively by other means." Lincoln continues, "The war has certainly progressed as favorably for us since the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation as before. I know as fully as one can know the opinion of others that some of the commanders of our armies in the field, who have given us our most important successes, believe the emancipation policy and the use of colored troops constitutes the heaviest blow yet dealt the rebellion, and that at least one of these important successes could not have been achieved when it was, but for the aid of black soldiers. Among the commanders holding these views are some who have never had any affinity with what is called abolitionism or with the Republican Party policies, but who held them purely as military opinions. You say that you will not fight to free the Negroes. Some of them seem willing to fight for you, but no matter. Fight you then exclusively to save the Union. I issued a proclamation on purpose to aid you in the saving the Union. Whenever you shall have conquered all resistance to the Union, if I shall urge you to continue fighting, it will be apt time then for you to declare that you will not fight the free Negroes. I thought that in your struggle for the Union, to whatever extent the Negroes should cease helping the enemy, to that extent, it weakens the enemy in his resistance to you. Do you think differently? I thought that whatever Negroes can be got to do as soldiers leaves just so much less for white soldiers to do in saving the Union. Does it appear otherwise to you? But Negroes, like other people, act upon motives. Why should they do anything for us if we will do nothing for them? If they stake their lives for us, they must be prompted by the strongest motive, even the promise of freedom, and the promise being made must be kept. And then there will be some black men who can remember that with silent tongue and clenched teeth and steady eye and well-poised bayonet, they have helped mankind upon this great consummation. While I fear there will be some white ones unable to forget that with malignant heart and deceitful speech, they have strove to hinder it. Still, let us not be overconfident of a speedy and final triumph. Let us be quite sober. Let us diligently apply the means, never doubting that a just God, in his own time, will give us the rightful results. Very truly yours, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln would later show his gratitude for the role of the United States Colored Troop in suppressing the rebellion by selecting 4 companies of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteers as part of his military escort during his second inaugural on March 4, 1865. That would be the first instance in which black troops participated in an inaugural day parade.
One of the important engagements of 1864 was the Battle of Nashville. On December the 15th and 16th, General George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland destroyed the Confederate Army of the Tennessee, which was commanded by John B. Hood. 8 black regiments played a vital role in that victory.
Thomas J. Morgan, colonel of the 14th United States Colored Infantry and commander of a brigade of 4 Negro regiments in the Battle of Nashville, gave the following account of his regiment from the time it was organized in November 1863 until the Battle of Nashville more than a year later.
The field, staff, and company officers were all white men. All of the non-commissioned officers, hospital steward, quartermaster sergeant, sergeant major, orderlies, sergeants, and corporals were colored. They proved very efficient. On August 15th, 1864, we had our first fight at Dalton, Georgia. General Wheeler, with a considerable force of Confederate cavalry, attacked Dalton, which was occupied by a small detachment of Union troops belonging to the 2nd Missouri. My regiment formed on the left of the 51st Indiana Infantry. The fight was short and not at all severe. The regiment was all exposed to fire. 1 private was killed, 1 lost a leg, and 1 was wounded in the right hand. Company B on the skirmish line killed 5 of the enemy and wounded others. To us, it was a great battle and a glorious victory. The regiment had been recognized as soldiers. It had taken its place side by a white regiment. It had been under fire. After the fight, as we marched into town through a pouring rain, a white regiment standing at rest swung their hats and gave 3 rousing cheers for the 14th Colored.
Pulaski, Tennessee. On September 27, 1864, I reported to Major General Rousseau, commanding a force of cavalry at Pulaski, Tennessee. As we approached the town by rail from Nashville, we heard artillery, then musketry, and as we left the cars, we saw the smoke of guns. Forrest, with a large body of cavalry, had been steadily driving Rousseau before him all day, and was destroying the railroad. Finding the general, I said, "I am ordered to report to you, sir, with 2 regiments of colored troops." By the general's direction, I threw out a strong line of skirmishers and posted the regiments on a ridge in good supporting distance. Rousseau's men retired behind my line, and Forrest's men pressed forward until they met our fire, and recognizing the sound of the Minute ball, stopped to reflect. The massacre of colored troops at Fort Pillow was well known to us and had been fully discussed by our men. It was rumored and thoroughly credited by them that General Forrest had offered $1,000 for the head of any commander of a black regiment. Here then was such an opportunity as those spoiling for a fight might desire. Negro troops stood face to face with Forrest's veteran cavalry. The fire was growing hotter, and balls were uncomfortably thick. At length, the enemy in strong force, with banners flying, bore down towards us in full sight, apparently bent on mischief. Pointing to the advancing column, I said, as I passed along the line, "Boys, it looks very much like a fight. Keep cool. Do your duty." They seemed full of glee and replied with great enthusiasm, "Colonel, they can't whip us. They never get the old 14th out of here, never. Never drives us away without a mighty lot of dead men." When Forrest learned that Rousseau was reinforced by infantry, he did not stop to ask the color of their skin, but after testing our line and finding it unyielding, returned to the east and struck over towards Murfreesboro.
Nashville, Tennessee. On November the 29th, 1864, the 14th, 16th, and 44th Regiments of United States Colored Infantry embarked on a railroad train at Chattanooga for Nashville. On December the 1st, with the 16th and most of the 14th, we reached our destination and were assigned to a place on the extreme left of General Thomas's army, then concentrating for the defense of Nashville against Hood's threatened attack.
Soon after taking our position in line at Nashville, we were closely besieged by Hood's army, and thus we lay facing each other for 2 weeks. Hood had suffered so terribly by his defeat under Schofield at Franklin that he was in no mood to assault us and our works, and Thomas needed more time to concentrate and reorganize his army before he could safely take the offensive. About 9 o'clock at night, December 14th, 1864, I was summoned to General Stedman's headquarters. He told me what the plan of battle was and said he wished me to open the fight by making a vigorous assault upon Hood's right flank. This, he explained, was to be a trick, intended to betray Hood into the belief that it was the real attack and to lead him to support his right by weakening his left, where Thomas intended assaulting him in very deed. The general gave me 4 colored regiments, a provisional brigade of white troops, and a section of artillery of the 20th Indiana Battery. As soon as the fog lifted, the battle began in good earnest. Hood mistook my assault for an attack in force upon his right flank, and weakening his left in order to meet it, gave the coveted opportunity to Thomas, who improved it by assailing Hood's left flank, doubling it up, and capturing a large number of prisoners.
Thus, the first day's fight wore away. It had been for us a severe but glorious day. Over 300 of our command had fallen, but everywhere our army was successful. General Stegman congratulated us, saying his only fear had been that we might fight too hard. We had done all he desired and more. Colored soldiers had again fought side by side with white troops. They had mingled together in the charge. They had supported each other. They had assisted each other from the field when wounded, and they lay side by side in death. The survivors rejoiced together over a hard-fought field won by common valor. During that night, Hood withdrew his army some 2 miles and took up a new line along the crest of some low hills which he strongly fortified with some improvised breastwork and abetis. Soon after our early breakfast, we moved forward over the intervening space. Our position was still on the extreme left of our line, and we were especially charged to look well to our flank to avoid surprise. The 2nd Colored Brigade, under Colonel Thompson of the 12th United States Colored Infantry, was on our right and participated in the first day's charge upon Overton's Hill, which was repulsed.
When the 2nd Colored Brigade retired behind my lines to reform, one of the regimental color bearers stepped in the open space between the two armies where, although exposed to a dangerous fire, he planted his flag firmly in the ground and began deliberately and coolly to return the enemy's fire, and greatly to our amusement, kept up for some little time his independent warfare. When the second and final assault was made, the right of our line took part. It was with breathless interest we watched that noble army climb the hill with a steady resolve which nothing but death itself could check. When at length the assaulting column sprang upon the earthworks, and the enemy, seeing that further resistance was madness, gave way and began a precipitous retreat, our hearts swelled as only the hearts of soldiers can, and scarcely stopping to cheer or to await orders, we pushed forward and joined in the pursuit until the darkness and the rain forced a halt. When General Thomas rode over the battlefield and saw the bodies of colored men side by side on the very works of the enemy, he turned to his staff saying, "Gentlemen, the question is settled. Negroes will fight."
While General Thomas and the Army of the Tennessee was routing and defeating the Confederate forces under General Hood, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, under Grant's overall command, were slowly squeezing and destroying Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in Petersburg and Richmond.
Colored soldiers played a vital role in the fighting around Petersburg, Virginia in 1864. Black regiments under General Edward Hinks assaulted and captured an important rebel entrenchment near the city.
Secretary of War Stanton, referring to the battles near Petersburg, told a newspaper reporter that the hardest fighting was done by the black troops. The forts they stormed were the worst of all.
General William F. Smith went to thank the black troops and tell them he was proud of their courage and dash. He said they cannot be exceeded as soldiers and that hereafter he will send them in difficult places as readily as the best white troops.
An officer of the 22nd U.S. Colored Infantry wrote enthusiastically to a Philadelphia newspaper, "The problem is solved. The Negro is a soldier, a man, a hero. I am prepared to say that I never, since the beginning of this war, saw troops fight better, more bravely, with more determination and enthusiasm." At the Battle of Chaffin's Farm in New Markets Heights, Virginia, 13 Negro regiments fought in that battle at the end of September, and a total of 37 medals of honor were awarded to veterans of that battle. 14 went to black soldiers.
The advance guard of Grant's army marched into Richmond on the morning of April the 2nd, 1865, and from there continued into Richmond, led by the Connecticut 29th Infantry, the United States Colored Troops. The capital of the Confederacy had fallen at long last. General Godfrey Weitzel, commander of the all-black 25th Corps, accepted the city's formal surrender.
As long lines of Negro cavalry flowed down Broad Street and raised their voices in ode to John Brown, the man that Robert E. Lee had helped bring to the gallows in that state only 6 years before, the black horsemen brandished their sabers and shouted in triumph, It was all music to the ears of free blacks and those who were only now freed from slavery. They stood atop shacks and waved their hats, crying, "The Lord bless the Yankees! The Lord bless the Yankees!" Black newspaper correspondent Thomas Morris Chester noted that the crowds included pious old Negroes, male and female, who called out to the black soldiers, "God bless you. Jesus has opened the way. We've been looking for you these many days. You've come at last."
One of the Union soldiers who entered Richmond that day was Garland White, who as a boy had been separated from his mother and sold to a young Georgian named Robert Toombs. Now the chaplain of the 28th U.S. Colored Infantry, White thrilled to the shouts of 10,000 voices celebrating liberation on the streets of the former Confederate capital. Black men and women gathered around him, urging him to speak, and so he did. He proclaimed for the first time in that city freedom to all mankind. As White stood in the street trying to take it all in, an older woman approached him and asked his name, his birthplace, and the name of his mother. When he had answered all her questions, she quietly informed him that this is your mother, Garland, who you are speaking to now, who has spent 20 years of grief about her son. And so she proved to be one of so many mothers and fathers that day peering hopefully into the faces of the black soldiers passing by, searching for remembered features of other children who had been sold south of this state in years and decades past.
John David Smith, in Lincoln and the United States Colored Troops, stated that President Lincoln greatly valued the service of the black men of the USCT. Their military contribution proved Lincoln's confidence in them to be well-deserved and disarmed white fears of black insurrections and mayhem. While Lincoln's final Emancipation Proclamation liberated and armed the slaves on paper, it was the men of the USCT, the United States Colored Troops, who welcomed them to their camps and liberated, sometime by force, slaves on farms and plantations as they enveloped the Confederacy. They, not Lincoln, fought directly for the freedom that Lincoln had promised.
President Lincoln summarized the contribution of Negro soldiers and laborers to the Union cause in a letter of September 12, 1864. We cannot spare the 140 or 50,000 now serving us as soldiers, seamen, and laborers. This is not a question of sentiment or taste, but one of physical force, which may be estimated as horsepower and steam power. Keep it, and you can save the Union. Throw it away, and the Union goes with it.
Official records show that approximately 180,000 enlisted black men and 7,000 white officers served in 175 Union regiments during the Civil War, nearly 10% of the Union Army. These men fought in 449 engagements, of which 39 were major battles. Approximately 37,300 Negroes lost their lives while serving in the Union Army. 17 black soldiers and 4 black sailors were awarded Medals of Honor. Thank you. Let me briefly introduce the cast here. First, there's my wife, Patricia James Davis. Pat is an actor and historic interpreter, member of the board of directors of Sacramento County Historical Society, and my find when I found gold. Okay. Next is Martin Wolf. Reverend Martin Wolf has served the Abraham Lincoln, he serves at the Abraham Lincoln Unitarian Universal Congregation for more than 12 years. He has been a Civil War reenactor and skirmisher for 20 years and is a member of the 114th Illinois Volunteer Infantry Regiment reenacted. And finally, there is well, I would like to say that everyone knows Jim Patton, but everyone does not know Jim Patton, and so let me introduce Jim Patton. Jim Patton is a native son of Springfield. He was president of the Saginaw County Historical Society, is currently president of the Elijah Iles House, Strawberry Ridge Shepherd House Foundation Board of Directors, and is a longtime member of the Abraham Lincoln Association Board of Directors. He is the Lieutenant Colonel of the 114th Regiment, Illinois Volunteer Infantry, reactivated. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bob. Thank you.